Don't worry, everyone. Aria is used to being the punchline. My father's voice boomed over the microphone, echoing across the lavish ballroom that I stood completely still in the middle of the Redwood Ridge Country Club, a half-empty glass of expensive champagne warming in my hand. The room was packed with 400 of the wealthiest and most influential people in California, politicians, investors, local media, and high society elites. They were all staring at me. Behind my father, a massive 12-meter LED screen dominated the reception hall. It wasn't showing a romantic slideshow of my sister and her new husband. Instead, massive, bold red words were flashing across the screen right next to an awkward, unsmiling photo of me. The words were impossible to miss. Sterile. Divorced. Failure. Family disgrace. The sound of 400 people laughing, whispering, and pointing filled the air, thick and suffocating. At the head table, my mother, Caroline, took a delicate sip of her martini, a faint, cold smile playing on her lips. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked victorious. Just a few feet away from me, my younger sister Lily, the bride, glowing in her custom designer gown, leaned over from her sweetheart table. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "I really hope you aren't going to cry and ruin my wedding photos," she sneered, making sure the people nearby could hear her that I didn't cry. I didn't scream, and I didn't run out of the venue in tears like they all expected me to. I just calmly reached into my clutch, pulled out my phone, and opened my messages. I typed exactly 2 words to a specific number, "Start it." I hit send, slipped the phone back into my bag, and took a slow sip of my champagne. I knew that in exactly 3 seconds, the entire wedding screen was going to be hijacked, and a 20-year secret kept by the Bennett family was going to detonate right in front of the city's elite. Did Tio understand how a family could orchestrate such a massive, public humiliation against their own blood? You have to rewind exactly 20 years. I grew up in Silver Oak Valley, a ridiculously wealthy town where your worth was strictly measured by your zip code and your bank account balance. In this town, the Bennett family was practically royalty, and we held the most power. My father, Victor Bennett, was a ruthless real estate tycoon who treated human beings like disposable corporate assets. My mother, Caroline, was the undisputed queen of the local social scene, caring far more about her image and country club gossip than her own children. Then there was Lily. She was the golden child, literally known as the princess of the town, who was heavily spoiled and could do absolutely no wrong in my parents' eyes. And then there was me. I was the black sheep. I didn't care about their country club politics. I didn't want to smile for the local papers, and I spoke my mind. The tension in the house was always thick, but things finally reached a catastrophic breaking point when I was 17 years old. The only person in my family who actually understood me, who saw through the superficial, toxic shell of the Bennett family, was my grandmother, Margaret Hale. She was an incredibly sharp and independent woman. On my 17th birthday, she did something that completely shattered our family dynamic. She gifted me a piece of property. It wasn't just a small, meaningless patch of dirt. She legally transferred 10 acres of pristine, highly coveted land right on the edge of Crystal Lake entirely into my name. It was an incredibly valuable piece of real estate, perhaps the most valuable undeveloped land left in the entire valley. My father was absolutely furious. His anger wasn't about me getting a nice birthday present. It was because he had been trying to get his hands on that exact piece of land for years. He had a massive, multi-million-dollar project in the works called the Eagle Crest Luxury Resort. Those 10 acres of lakefront property were sitting directly in the middle of his planned development, right where the luxury waterfront villas were supposed to go. The ink on the deed was barely dry before he called me into his massive home office. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't even say happy birthday. He just pointed to a transfer of ownership document he had already drafted, sitting on his mahogany desk right next to a gold pen. He told me that Grandma Margaret was getting old, that she had made a foolish mistake, and that I needed to sign the land over to his company immediately so he could begin construction. He didn't ask me. He ordered me. That I looked him right in the eyes, and I refused. I told him the land was mine. It was a special gift from my grandmother, and I wasn't going to let him pave over it for another soulless corporate resort. The look on his face in that moment is something I will never forget. It wasn't just parental anger. It was pure, calculating corporate rage. I had defied him, and in Victor Bennett's world, disobedience was punished with complete and utter destruction. I honestly thought that would be the end of it. I figured he would yell at me, maybe ground me for a few months, and try to pressure me into signing it later. I was incredibly naive. Just 3 days later, I found out exactly what kind of monster my father truly was. That I woke up that morning and tried to log into my college savings account to pay an early application fee. The balance was zero. He had completely drained every single penny of the college fund that my grandparents had originally started for me. When I confronted him in the hallway, he just coldly stated that if I wanted to be an independent property owner, I could pay for my own education. But he didn't stop at my finances. By noon that same day, vicious rumors were spreading like wildfire around the valley. My parents had actively planted fake stories through my mother's gossip network, telling everyone that I had dropped out of high school and run away with some older guy. They assassinated my character before I even had a chance to defend myself. That evening, the final blow came. I walked up the driveway after school to find my father standing on the front porch. The locks on the front door had already been changed. He tossed a cheap, old backpack onto the concrete at my feet. Inside were just a few basic changes of clothes and a toothbrush. He looked at me with absolute ice in his eyes and told me I was no longer a Bennett. I was no longer his daughter, and he was kicking me out of the house. He threatened that if I ever set foot on his property again, he would have me arrested for trespassing. I looked past him to the living room window. My mother was standing there, watching the whole thing. She didn't flinch. She just turned her back and walked away. Lily was standing next to her, actually smiling. I picked up the backpack and walked down the long, gated driveway of my own home with exactly $71 in my pocket. I was a 17-year-old girl, completely cut off from the world, with my reputation destroyed in the only town I had ever known. I tried to reach out to my friends, my aunts, my uncles, but they all turned their backs. No one in the entire town wanted to cross Victor Bennett, so no one stood by my side. $71 and a cheap, fraying canvas backpack. That was my entire net worth when I walked away from the massive, wrought iron gates of the Bennett estate. I didn't have a fairy godmother waiting in the wings to save me, and there was absolutely no secret bank account to fall back on because my father had vindicatively seen to that. For the first 3 agonizing weeks of my exile, my bedroom was the cramped, freezing back seat of an old, beat-up car. I learned very quickly how invisible and vulnerable you become when you no longer have a powerful, wealthy last name protecting you from the harsh realities of the world. I had to survive, so I took whatever grueling manual labor I could find in the neighboring towns, far away from where the Bennett shadow stretched. I spent my daylight hours scrubbing toilets, making beds, and dealing with entitled guests as a hotel room maid. Then, I would swap uniforms and spend my nights wiping down sticky, beer-stained counters and managing rowdy crowds as a bar waitress. The physical exhaustion was bone-deep, a constant ache in my muscles that never went away, but I absolutely refused to let Victor Bennett win. After my late-night shifts ended at 2 in the morning, I would sit under the flickering, harsh fluorescent lights of a 24-hour laundromat, poring over cheap textbooks to study for my GED. Getting that high school equivalency diploma was just the first tiny step on a massive, unforgiving mountain. I immediately enrolled in a local community college, taking every single class I could possibly afford while still working double shifts to keep a roof over my head. I didn't have time for friends. I didn't have the luxury of going to parties, and I certainly didn't have a single second to waste on self-pity. My anger and resentment became my primary fuel. That relentless, sleep-deprived grind eventually paid off in a spectacular way that my family would have never thought possible. Against all odds, I was accepted as a transfer student into the highly prestigious Stanford School of Architecture. For the next few years, I buried myself entirely in complex blueprints, structural engineering formulas, and rigorous historical design principles. I lived in the architecture studios, surviving on cheap coffee and spite while surrounded by trust fund kids who had no idea what real struggle looked like. When graduation day finally arrived, I walked across that legendary stage, knowing with absolute certainty that I had finished in the top 3 of my entire graduating class. I remember standing there in the bright California sun in my cap and gown, holding a degree from one of the best universities in the world, and looking out into the massive crowd of cheering, weeping families. There was not a single person there for me. My entire family had ignored the milestone completely, leaving my section of the audience entirely empty. Despite my incredible academic success, the deep psychological damage of my toxic upbringing was a ghost I couldn't easily shake off. When I was 25 years old, still carrying the emotional scars of my rejection, I made the biggest, most devastating mistake of my adult life. I married a man named Daniel Cross. The truly tragic, twisted irony of my marriage to Daniel was that he was a lingering shadow from my past. My father had actually arranged the match for me long before he kicked me out of the house. Subconsciously, maybe a broken, deeply traumatized part of me thought that marrying the man my father had originally chosen would somehow prove my worth to him, or perhaps bring some twisted sense of conventional stability to my chaotic life. I was dead wrong. Marrying Daniel wasn't an escape into a better life. It was just stepping blindly into a different kind of prison. Daniel was an absolute master of quiet, suffocating, psychological control. It didn't start with shouting or physical violence. It started with gentle suggestions about how we should manage our money as a couple, which very quickly turned into complete and total financial control. Every single penny I earned as a junior architect was intensely scrutinized, and I had to literally justify buying a cheap cup of coffee on my way to work. Then came the overwhelming paranoia. He started aggressively tracking my phone's location, demanding to know exactly where I was the second I left the office building. If I was stuck in afternoon traffic for 10 minutes longer than usual, my phone would ring relentlessly until I answered. He systematically and intentionally isolated me from the few friends and professional contacts I had managed to make over the years, ensuring he was the only voice of authority and influence in my world. I spent 4 agonizing years trapped in that suffocating, hellish marriage before I finally found the courage to pack my bags in the middle of the night, walk out the door, and file for divorce. That I thought the divorce would finally be the end of my personal nightmares, but life had one more utterly devastating blow waiting for me. I was 29 years old, finally legally free, and desperately trying to rebuild my life from scratch when I started feeling physically wrong. A terrifying trip to a medical specialist confirmed my absolute worst fears. I sat frozen in a sterile, cold doctor's office and listened in shock as a physician gently explained that I was suffering from premature ovarian failure. At 29, I was entirely sterile. The doctor looked me in the eyes with deep pity and handed me a piece of paper with a devastating medical statistic. I had a less than 3% chance of ever having a biological child of my own. It broke me into a million pieces. It was a deeply personal, crushing grief that I kept locked away in the darkest corner of my own heart. But in a wealthy, toxic town like Silver Oak Valley, secrets are currency, and somehow the Bennett family found out about my private medical condition. They didn't reach out to comfort me. They didn't send a card or offer a shoulder to cry on. Instead, they added it to their twisted arsenal, weaponizing my physical tragedy as just another piece of cruel gossip to prove to their country club friends how broken and defective the exiled Bennett daughter truly was. But profound pain changes people. Some people let it completely destroy them, and others use it to forge an unbreakable armor. I chose the armor. Over the next 6 years, I poured every single ounce of my grief, my boiling anger, and my relentless, obsessive drive into my architectural career. By the time I turned 35, I had completely transformed my professional life and standing. I wasn't just a lowly junior drafter taking orders anymore. I had fought my way to the very top of the industry to become the lead restoration architect at Hawthorne and Vale Architects, one of the most respected, elite, and notoriously hard-to-enter firms on the West Coast. Right now, in the present day, I am personally overseeing the crown jewel of our firm's massive portfolio, the Silver Oak Historic Mill Restoration. It is a massive, incredibly complex, and highly visible project that requires absolute precision, a massive budget, and deep historical expertise. But the most important part of this massive project isn't just the architecture itself, it's the financial backing. The entire restoration is being exclusively funded by the legendary Blackwood Heritage Trust. In the intricate, cutthroat, and wealth-obsessed hierarchy of California's elite society, the Bennett family might be considered local royalty, but the Blackwoods are the undisputed emperors. They are an old money family whose sheer power, unfathomable wealth, and political influence severely eclipse absolutely everything my father has ever built. Having the trust and the ear of the Blackwood family meant I held a quiet, untouchable power in the very circles my parents worshipped at my family. Utterly consumed by their own massive arrogance and local vanity, had absolutely no idea about who I had become. They still pictured me as the broken, destitute 17-year-old girl they literally threw onto the street like garbage. They thought I was a failed, sterile divorcee who had amounted to absolutely nothing in life. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they were, but it all started with a single, unexpected phone call that violently pulled me back into their toxic orbit just weeks before Lily's extravagant wedding. The entire trajectory of my life shifted on a random Tuesday afternoon, just 3 weeks before my sister Lily was scheduled to walk down the aisle. I was sitting in my spacious corner office at Hawthorne and Vale, reviewing the final structural blueprints for the Silver Oak Historic Mill restoration, when my private cell phone rang. It was an unknown local number. Normally, I would send it straight to voicemail, but something in my gut told me to answer. When I picked up, a quiet, hesitant voice introduced herself as Clara Martinez, a senior cardiac nurse working at the Silver Oak Medical Center. My blood ran cold the second she said the name of the hospital. Clara had tracked down my contact information through a mutual acquaintance because she felt a deep moral obligation to reach out to me. She told me, in a very gentle and sympathetic tone, that my grandmother, Margaret Hale, had been admitted to the intensive care unit and was scheduled for an incredibly high-risk heart surgery in just a few days. That my grandmother was the only person in the Bennett family who had ever shown me an ounce of genuine love, and hearing that her life was hanging by a thread felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Clara explained that Margaret was extremely weak, her condition was deteriorating rapidly, and she had explicitly asked to see me before they took her into the operating room. I immediately stood up from my desk, grabbed my car keys, and told Clara I was on my way to the hospital. But Clara stopped me with a heavy sigh. She explained that my father, Victor Bennett, had legally positioned himself as my grandmother's primary medical proxy. He was completely controlling her visitor list with an iron fist, practically keeping her under armed guard to ensure I couldn't get anywhere near her room, that I didn't care about his rules. I demanded to speak with him, and Clara reluctantly patched my father through to the room's landline. Hearing Victor Bennett's voice after nearly 2 decades of absolute silence was physically nauseating. He didn't sound worried about his own mother's failing heart. He sounded completely in control, smug and transactional. When I begged him to let me see my grandmother, he didn't hesitate to use a dying woman as leverage. He laid down a cruel, non-negotiable condition. I was only allowed to see Margaret on the strict condition that I attend Lily's upcoming wedding. He wanted me there, sitting in the pews, playing the role of the disgraced, broken daughter to make his golden child's wedding look even more spectacular by comparison. It was a sick, twisted form of emotional blackmail, but I had absolutely no choice. I swallowed my pride, choked back my absolute disgust, and agreed to his terms that I thought that was the end of the conversation, but about an hour later my phone rang again. It was Clara, this time calling from her personal cell phone. She was speaking in a rushed, hushed whisper from a hospital supply closet. She told me that after I hung up, she had been adjusting my grandmother's 4-line and overheard Victor and my mother, Caroline, talking freely in the room. Clara warned me that my family wasn't just inviting me to the wedding to sit quietly in the back. They were actively preparing a massive, public surprise meant to completely destroy me during the reception. They wanted to make a horrific spectacle out of my failures in front of the entire town. Clara didn't know the exact details of what they were planning, but she knew it was designed to be a definitive, humiliating execution of my character point 20 years ago. A warning like that would have sent me running for the hills in absolute tears. But I wasn't a scared, penniless 17-year-old girl anymore. I was a 35-year-old woman who had survived homelessness, crawled her way through a top-tier university, escaped a highly abusive marriage, and conquered a fiercely competitive, male-dominated corporate industry. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I got incredibly angry, and then I got to work. If my family wanted to turn Lily's wedding into a public execution, I was going to make sure they were the ones standing on the trapdoor. The first call I made was to my absolute best friend in the world, Ryan Carter. Ryan and I had met years ago during my darkest days after the divorce. He was an ex-military IT specialist who now ran a highly lucrative private cybersecurity firm. He was fiercely loyal, brilliant with a computer, and he knew absolutely everything about the horrific abuse my family had put me through. I drove straight to his apartment, poured him a cup of coffee, and laid out the entire situation: the blackmail, my grandmother's surgery, and the impending public humiliation at the wedding. Ryan didn't even blink. He simply cracked his knuckles, opened his laptop, and smiled that we needed a way to control the environment at the wedding reception. The event was being held at the exclusive Redwood Ridge Country Club, a venue that relied heavily on external contractors for their massive, over-the-top events. Within 20 minutes of aggressive digging online, Ryan discovered exactly what we needed. He found out that the specific audiovisual company contracted to run the massive screens, microphones, and lighting for Lily's wedding was desperately short on staff. They were actively looking for an emergency technician to run the main control board for the evening. Ryan immediately fabricated a flawless resume, applied for the open position, and used his extensive technical credentials to get hired on the spot. Just like that, my best friend had complete, unhindered access to the entire technological nervous system of my sister's wedding. With Ryan firmly embedded behind enemy lines, I spent the next 3 days meticulously building my weapon. I created a comprehensive, devastating slideshow presentation, and I bluntly titled it "The Truth About Aria Bennett." I didn't fill it with emotional rants or angry accusations. I filled it with cold, hard, undeniable facts. I scanned and uploaded my official Stanford School of Architecture degree. I included high-resolution photos of the massive, multi-million-dollar restoration projects I had successfully led. I added screenshots of the prestigious national and international architecture awards I had won over the years. Then, I meticulously documented the exact truth about how I was thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing, contrasting it with the vicious, fabricated lies my parents had spread about me running away. Finally, I scanned the original, legally binding property deed for the 10 acres of land at Crystal Lake, the exact piece of paper that had started this entire 20-year nightmare. I handed the encrypted USB drive over to Ryan. The trap was officially set, but before the wedding could happen, I needed to see my grandmother. The night before her high-risk operation, Clara Martinez risked her own job to help me. She texted me at 2 a.m, telling me that Victor had finally gone home to sleep and the security guard was on a coffee break. I slipped into the hospital through the loading dock, quietly rode the service elevator to the ICU, and walked into my grandmother's dimly lit room. Seeing her frail, fragile body hooked up to dozens of beeping monitors absolutely broke my heart, but her eyes were just as sharp and defiant as I remembered that I sat by her bed, holding her thin, shaking hand, and we cried together for the first time in 20 years. She apologized over and over again for not being able to protect me from Victor, but I stopped her. I told her about everything I had achieved, about my career, and about how her strength had kept me going. Then, the conversation naturally shifted to the piece of land she had given me for my 17th birthday. I told her how sorry I was that Victor had ultimately stolen it from me, assuming he had somehow forged my signature or legally manipulated the deed after he kicked me out of the house. That my grandmother weakly squeezed my hand, her eyes suddenly burning with an intense, familiar fire. She looked around the quiet hospital room, leaned in close to me, and dropped a bombshell that completely paralyzed me. She told me that the land was never transferred to my father. The deed was still fully, legally, and entirely in my name, locked safely away in a private trust that Victor had absolutely no access to. I stared at her in pure shock, my mind racing to comprehend what she was saying. If Victor didn't own the land, how was he currently building the massive Eagle Crest luxury resort right on top of it? My grandmother smiled a sad, bitter smile and explained the horrifying reality of my father's business empire. Victor Bennett had been lying for exactly 20 years. He had actively committed massive, systemic financial fraud. He had taken the fake and signed transfer documents, lied to his incredibly powerful investors, and fraudulently used my 10 acres of pristine lakefront property as collateral to secure massive bank loans and sign multi-million-dollar project contracts. His entire empire, his wealth, and his unshakable reputation in Silver Oak Valley were all built on a massive, illegal house of cards. And in that tiny hospital room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, I realized that I didn't just have the power to embarrass my family at a wedding. I had the legal power to completely and utterly destroy them. Walking out of the Silver Oak Medical Center that night, the humid California air hit me like a physical wall. My mind was spinning so fast I could barely feel my feet hitting the pavement. For 20 years, I had carried the heavy, agonizing belief that my father had somehow legally outmaneuvered me, that he had forged my signature or exploited a dark legal loophole to steal the 10 acres of Crystal Lake property my grandmother had given me. But the truth was so much darker, and incredibly, so much more reckless. Victor Bennett hadn't found a brilliant legal loophole. He had simply lied to absolutely everyone. He had taken a piece of land he did not own, forged the narrative, and used my property as the foundational collateral to secure massive bank loans and sign multi-million-dollar contracts for his prized Eagle Crest luxury resort. He was building a staggering financial empire on top of a massive, undeniable, highly illegal house of cards. And now, I held a single match that could burn the entire thing straight to the ground. Over the next few days, I didn't say a word to anyone except Ryan. We went over the plan 100 times in his apartment, fueled by black coffee and pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Ryan was already fully embedded at the Redwood Ridge Country Club, having easily secured the emergency audio-visual technician job for the wedding reception. Through his newly acquired access, he had complete, unrestricted control over the main soundboard, the lighting rigs, and most importantly, the massive video system that my family planned to use against me. I spent those final days before the wedding existing in a state of icy, absolute calm. The anxiety and the deep-seated fear of my family that had plagued me for my entire adult life were completely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp, calculating focus. I was finally going to look the monster in the eye, and I wasn't going to blink. When the day of the wedding finally arrived, I didn't dress like the broken, destitute failure my family expected me to be. I wore a perfectly tailored, understated designer dress that commanded quiet respect, the kind of piece you only know how to buy when you've spent years moving quietly among the ultra-wealthy elite in the architectural world. I drove myself to the Redwood Ridge Country Club, handed my car keys to the valet, and walked through the massive, gilded double doors of the main venue. The sheer scale of the event was exactly what you would expect from the Bennett family's insatiable need to show off their wealth. There were exactly 400 guests packed into the sprawling, opulent ballroom. It wasn't just family and childhood friends. Victor had strategically invited local politicians, heavy-hitting real estate investors, and even prominent representatives from the local media. He was treating his youngest daughter's wedding like a massive corporate networking event, a lavish, extravagant display of his untouchable power and influence in Silver Oak Valley. As I walked into the room, I immediately felt the heavy, judgmental stares of the people who recognized me. Whispers followed me like a shadow. People who hadn't seen me since I was a terrified 17-year-old girl were nudging each other, pointing, and gossiping behind their expensive champagne flutes that I found my assigned seat at a miserable little table shoved all the way in the back corner of the room, right next to the swinging kitchen doors. It was a highly calculated insult meant to remind me of my place, but I honestly didn't care. I sat quietly, sipping my sparkling water, and watched the grand spectacle unfold. I watched Lily, dripping in custom lace and diamonds, playing the perfect, glowing bride for the cameras. I watched my mother, Caroline, working the room like a seasoned politician, flashing her fake, practiced smile at the investors and society wives. And I watched Victor, holding court at the massive head table, looking completely invincible. About 2 hours into the reception, after the expensive plated dinners had been cleared away and the wine was flowing heavily, the lights in the massive ballroom suddenly dimmed. A hush fell over the 400 guests. Soft, dramatic music began to play through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. At the front of the room, positioned directly behind the massive head table, a towering 12-meter LED screen slowly flickered to life. This was it. This was the surprise Clara had warned me about while I was standing in the hospital. I expected a montage of embarrassing childhood photos, or maybe a passive-aggressive speech from my father masking insults as jokes. I severely underestimated just how deeply, brutally cruel the Bennett family could truly be. The screen didn't show romantic pictures of Lily and her new husband. It showed a massive, highly unflattering photograph of me, taken from a distance years ago when I was completely exhausted and working 3 jobs just to survive. Then, the music shifted to something jarring, and massive, bold words began slamming onto the 12-meter screen in aggressive, blood-red typography. The first word flashed dropout. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. I could see the local media representatives actually pulling out their phones to record the spectacle, eager for high society gossip. The screen flashed again, gold digger. They were directly referencing my horrific, abusive marriage to Daniel, twisting the painful narrative to make it look like I had tried to scam him out of his money before the divorce. Then came the next word, divorced. The murmurs in the massive ballroom turned into scattered, highly uncomfortable chuckles. People in the audience were actually laughing at the public crucifixion of a family member. Another word slammed onto the screen, broke. They were intentionally painting a picture of a pathetic, desperate woman who had crawled back to her wealthy family to beg for scraps at the dinner table. But the final word, the final slide, was the one that actually made my breath catch in my throat. It was the one secret I had kept guarded so closely, the one devastating medical tragedy that had shattered my heart into a million pieces. The massive LED screen flashed the word, sterile. They didn't just want to mock my finances or my failed marriage. They wanted to publicly humiliate me for my medical inability to have biological children, broadcasting my deepest, most agonizing trauma to 400 strangers, investors, and politicians. The sheer, unadulterated evil of that moment was suffocating. The entire room erupted into a mixture of shocked gasps, loud whispers, and outright laughter from the cruelest members of the elite crowd. Victor Bennett stood up from his seat at the head table, holding a microphone. He didn't look ashamed that his eldest daughter was being publicly humiliated. He looked like a king executing a traitor in the town square. "Don't worry, everyone," his voice boomed over the speakers, echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. "Aria is used to being the punchline. She always liked attention." My mother took a delicate sip of her martini, a cold, satisfied smirk locked onto her face. Lily, the beautiful, radiant bride, leaned over from her sweetheart table. She looked directly at me, her eyes filled with absolute malice, and spoke loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear over the noise. "I really hope you aren't going to cry and ruin my wedding photos," she sneered as I stood up from my chair in the back corner of the room. I didn't run out the doors. I didn't scream at them. I didn't let a single tear fall from my eyes. I calmly reached into my designer clutch, pulled out my cell phone, and opened my text messages. I looked up at the sound booth hidden in the back balcony, knowing Ryan was sitting right there in the dark, his hand hovering over the master control switch that I typed exactly 2 words. "Start it." I hit send, slipped the phone back into my bag, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. I knew that in exactly 3 seconds, Ryan was going to pull their flash drive, plug in our encrypted USB, and the entire wedding screen was going to be violently hijacked. The Bennett family thought they had just delivered the final, fatal blow to my life. They had absolutely no idea that I was about to drop a nuclear bomb on theirs. The second I hit send on that text message, my eyes locked onto the massive 12-meter screen at the front of the ballroom. For exactly 3 seconds, the horrible, blood-red word, sterile, continued to burn into the retinas of 400 people. The cruel laughter and the whispered gossip were still echoing off the crystal chandeliers. My father, Victor, was still standing at the head table with a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face, holding the microphone like a weapon. My sister Lily was still sneering at me from her sweetheart table. They thought they had won. They thought they had finally broken me in front of the entire town. Then, the state-of-the-art sound system let out a sharp, piercing screech. The deafening feedback made half the room physically flinch and cover their ears. Up in the darkened audiovisual booth on the second-floor balcony, Ryan Carter had just violently yanked my father's flash drive out of the main control board and slammed our heavily encrypted USB drive into the primary port. The massive LED screen instantly went pitch black. The sudden, total darkness in the front of the room immediately silenced the crowd. The laughter died in their throats. Victor tapped the microphone twice, looking annoyed, assuming it was just a technical glitch. He muttered something to my mother, motioning for one of the country club managers to fix it, but the manager couldn't fix it, because Ryan had already locked out the entire local network. Suddenly, a new image exploded onto the massive screen, brighter and sharper than before. The background was a sleek, professional black, and elegant, crisp white letters spelled out a brand new title. The Real Story of Aria Bennett. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expensive silk dresses and tailored suits rustling in the sudden tension. My mother, Caroline, lowered her martini glass, her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. The slide transitioned seamlessly. Instead of a horrific, unkempt photo of me from my darkest days, the screen displayed a massive, high-resolution scan of my official diploma from the Stanford School of Architecture. The university seal gleamed in gold. Next to the diploma was a stark, undeniable fact printed in bold text: graduated top 3 of her class. I could literally hear the wealthy society wives at the tables near me sharply inhaling. In Silver Oak Valley, Ivy League and elite university degrees were the ultimate status symbols, and they had just been told I was a pathetic high school dropout. Before they could even process the diploma, the screen shifted again. Now, it was displaying a breathtaking, sweeping drone shot of a massive commercial development in downtown San Francisco. It was a multi-million-dollar corporate plaza that I had personally designed from the ground up. The text below it simply read, "Lead architect, click." The next slide appeared. It was a photograph of me standing on a brightly lit stage in New York City, shaking hands with the president of the American Institute of Architects. I was holding a heavy glass trophy. The text read, "Winner, National Architectural Excellence Award, click." A beautiful, sprawling, modern mid-century home sitting on a cliffside overlooking the Pacific Ocean filled the 12-meter screen. It was stunning, surrounded by lush, meticulous landscaping. The caption read, "Area's private residence, fully paid." It was a direct, lethal counterattack to the broke and gold digger lies they had just broadcasted to the entire room. Click. A high-definition, perfectly cropped image of a double-page spread from Forbes magazine appeared. There was a professional portrait of me, standing in front of a drafting table, looking confident and in command. The headline of the article was massive and impossible to miss: "The Visionary Women Reshaping West Coast Architecture." By the time the Forbes article hit the screen, the atmosphere in the Redwood Ridge Country Club had completely transformed. The cruel laughter was entirely gone. The whispers had stopped. The room was absolutely, suffocatingly silent. 400 of the most powerful people in California were sitting completely paralyzed, their eyes darting rapidly back and forth between the massive screen and my father. Victor's face had drained of all color. He looked like he had just been physically struck by a freight train. The smug, arrogant grin was completely wiped away, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He looked down at the microphone in his hand as if he had forgotten what it was. He was desperately trying to process how the broken, destitute daughter he had kicked out onto the street with nothing but a canvas backpack and $71 had somehow managed to build a life that was arguably more impressive, more legitimate, and more respected than his OWN.AT the sweetheart table. Lily looked completely lost. She was staring at the Forbes article on the screen, her mouth slightly open, the heavy diamond necklace sparkling on her chest suddenly looking very cheap compared to the genuine, self-made success staring back at her. But the slideshow wasn't the final blow. It was just the setup. The real devastation came from the audience itself, sitting at table 1, right in the center of the VIP section, the absolute best seats in the entire house, was a woman named Eleanor Blackwood. She was the ruthless, highly respected, and terrifyingly powerful chairwoman of the Blackwood Heritage Trust. In the cutthroat hierarchy of California wealth, the Blackwoods were the undisputed apex predators. My father had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to get into Eleanor's inner circle, practically begging for her to invest in his commercial projects. He had invited her to Lily's wedding specifically to impress her with his family's prestige and dominance. That I and the dead. Heavy silence of the ballroom. Eleanor Blackwood slowly stood up from her chair. She didn't look at Victor. She didn't look at the bride. She turned her body, scanning the massive room until her piercing, sharp eyes locked directly onto me, sitting alone at the miserable little table shoved in the back corner by the kitchen doors. Eleanor raised her voice. She didn't use a microphone, but she didn't need one. Her tone was sharp, commanding, and laced with absolute, chilling authority. It cut through the silent ballroom like a surgeon's scalpel. "Victor," Eleanor said, her voice echoing perfectly in the quiet room, "I find your presentation incredibly confusing." Victor swallowed hard, his hands visibly shaking. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic choke sound came out. "Eleanor, I "This is a misunderstanding." Eleanor ignored his stammering entirely. She kept her eyes locked on me and continued, making sure every single politician, investor, and reporter in the room heard every single word she said. "You just stood up here and called this young woman a failure and a disgrace," Eleanor stated, her voice dripping with pure ice. Which is fascinating to me, considering that Bennett is currently the lead restoration architect for the Blackwood Heritage Trust. A collective, synchronized gasp tore through the 400 guests. Eleanor wasn't finished. She delivered the final, crushing strike with devastating precision. She is personally overseeing our newest cultural initiative. She is the brilliant mind leading a project that my family is personally funding to the tune of $120 million. The silence that followed that statement was the loudest sound I have ever heard in my entire life. $120 million. In the world of real estate and development, that number was a titan. It dwarfed absolutely everything my father had ever built. It made his prized Eagle Crest luxury resort look like a child's lemonade stand. And I was the one running it. Victor Bennett was completely, utterly paralyzed. He stood frozen at the head table, the microphone slipping from his sweating fingers and hitting the polished wooden table with a loud, dull thud. He was staring at Eleanor Blackwood with wide, terrified eyes, completely incapable of formulating a single coherent response. His entire carefully constructed reality, his local dominance, his absolute control over his family's narrative, his attempt to publicly execute my reputation, had just been entirely pulverized in less than 60 seconds, but I wasn't done. The slideshow and Eleanor's incredible intervention had destroyed their social standing and their fake narrative, but they had stolen 20 years of my peace, and my father was currently building a massive fraud on my property. It was time for the third and final bomb. I slowly stood up from my table, my eyes locked dead onto my father's pale, sweating face, and I reached into my designer clutch one last time. I stood perfectly still in the dead silence of a sprawling ballroom, the heavy, suffocating weight of 400 stares entirely focused on me. Eleanor Blackwood's devastating revelation was still hanging in the air, a massive, invisible guillotine that had just cleanly severed my father's reputation from his reality. But I wasn't finished. They had stolen 20 years of my peace, they had weaponized my deepest physical trauma for cheap country club entertainment, and my father was currently building a fraudulent, multi-million-dollar empire on top of my grandmother's legacy. It was time to drop the third and final bomb. I slowly reached into my designer clutch one last time, my fingers wrapping around a thick, folded piece of watermarked legal paper. "You all just sat here and watched my father call me a thief, a gold digger, and a failure," I started, my voice perfectly level and calm, projecting clearly across the massive, silent room without needing a microphone. "He told you that I ran away when I was 17. He told you I was a disgrace to the Bennett name. But he conveniently left out the most important chapter of the story." I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod up toward the darkened audio-visual booth on the second-floor balcony. Ryan, watching my every move through the camera feeds, knew exactly what to do. The massive 12-meter LED screen behind the head table flashed one final time. It wasn't a photograph of a building or a prestigious award this time. It was a high-resolution, unredacted scan of a very specific, legally binding property deed, and I held up the physical copy of the document in my hand, raising it so the VIP tables near the front could see the official county notary seals stamped on the bottom. 20 years ago, my grandmother, Margaret Hale, gifted me 10 acres of pristine, undeveloped lakefront property at Crystal Lake for my 17th birthday. I said, locking eyes directly with a group of older men in expensive tailored suits sitting just to the right of the center aisle. I knew exactly who they were. They were my father's primary financial backers, the heavy-hitting investors who had poured millions into his company. The exact same 10 acres of land that currently serve as the physical foundation and the primary financial collateral for the Eagle Crest luxury resort. Victor tried to lunge forward from the head table, but his legs seemed to completely give out beneath him, and he stumbled, bracing himself heavily against the white linen tablecloth. "Turn that off!" he finally screamed, his voice cracking with a pathetic, raw desperation that I had never heard from him before. "Security! Get her out of here right now!" But the security guards stationed by the main doors didn't move an inch. They were hourly country club staff, And right now, the most powerful woman in the entire state, Eleanor Blackwood, was watching me with an approving, icy gaze. No one in that room was going to lay a single finger on me. My father kicked me out onto the street with absolutely nothing but a backpack because I refused to sign that land over to his development company. I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and cutting through Victor's frantic shouting. But he didn't let a little thing like actual legal ownership stop him. For 20 years, Victor Bennett has lied to every single bank, every single business partner, and every single investor in this room. He never owned the land. My signature was never on any transfer document. He committed massive, systemic financial fraud to build his local empire, and he is actively building the Eagle Crest project on land that legally, fully, and undeniably belongs to me. Pandemonium absolutely erupted. It wasn't just shocked gasps and hushed whispers anymore. It was an immediate, violent explosion of shouting and pure, unadulterated chaos. The 400 guests, who had been sitting in stunned silence just seconds before, collectively lost their minds. The investors sitting in the VIP section jumped to their feet, their faces turning purple with a mixture of absolute rage and profound financial terror. These were men who had staked their own massive reputations and millions of dollars on my father's supposedly bulletproof, highly vetted real estate fund. I watched as one prominent local commercial banker physically threw his silk napkin onto the floor, pulled out his cell phone, and stormed aggressively toward the ballroom exit, loudly barking frantic orders to his legal team to freeze all associated assets and pull their funding immediately. The massive investment contracts that Victor had spent years carefully cultivating were literally collapsing and evaporating in real time, right in front of the 5-tier wedding cake. Through the absolute chaos, I shifted my gaze over to the sweetheart table to see the fallout of the golden child. Lily was trembling violently, her perfect, expensive bridal makeup beginning to run down her cheeks as tears of actual, genuine panic welled in her eyes. But the most telling and devastating reaction wasn't hers. It was her new husband's. He wasn't wrapping his arms around her to comfort her. He had physically backed away from her, his chair scraping loudly and harshly against the polished hardwood floor. He was staring at Lily, and then up at Victor, with a look of absolute, unfiltered horror and disgust. He realized in that exact, crushing moment that he hadn't just married into local Silver Oak royalty. He had just legally and publicly tied his own name and his own future to a rapidly sinking ship of federal fraud, massive debt, and public disgrace. I could see his lips moving rapidly, intensely whispering to Lily, his hands gesturing wildly as he began furiously questioning everything she had ever told him about her family, their wealth, and their supposed prestige. The fairy tale wedding was over before the ink on the marriage license was even our wide-at-my mother, Caroline, the undisputed queen of the Valley's high society, looked like she was physically shrinking and collapsing into her expensive dining chair. The same wealthy society wives she had just been laughing and drinking martinis with, the very women who had happily chuckled at the cruel word, sterile, flashing on the screen just minutes ago, were now actively turning their backs on her, whispering furiously behind their hands. The massive, cruel social execution she had so meticulously planned for me had completely backfired, entirely and permanently destroying her own untouchable social status in a matter of seconds. The grand, extravagant wedding reception didn't end with a romantic first dance, heartfelt toasts, or a joyful bouquet toss. It ended in a mass, deeply humiliating exodus. Once Eleanor Blackwood gave me a brief, highly respectful nod and gracefully exited the ballroom with her private security and entourage, the invisible dam completely broke. It was like watching rats frantically flee a sinking ship. The local politicians and city council members, absolutely terrified of being photographed or associated anywhere near a man who was about to be publicly indicted for massive real estate fraud, practically power-walked toward the coat check. The wealthy guests and investors were already gone, speeding out of the valet line in their luxury cars to call their crisis managers and lawyers. Within 15 minutes of my final announcement, the lavish, million-dollar reception hall was virtually emptied as I stood in the middle of the rapidly clearing room, calmly taking a final sip of my champagne as I watched the total, smoldering wreckage of the Bennett family empire surrounding me. I didn't feel the need to walk up to the head table and gloat to my father. I didn't need to scream at my mother or demand an apology from my crying sister. The deafening silence of the abandoned, ruined ballroom and the sheer, pathetic sight of Victor Bennett slumped heavily in his chair, staring blankly at the floor with his head in his hands, was all the closure I would ever need in this lifetime. I carefully put the folded property deed back into my clutch, gave a small, two-finger salute up to the darkened balcony, where Ryan was undoubtedly grinning from ear to ear, and calmly walked out the massive front doors of the Redwood Ridge Country Club, leaving my family completely alone in the devastating mess they had spent 20 years creating. The morning after the wedding, the sun rose over Silver Oak Valley exactly like it always did, but the reality for the Bennett family had fundamentally and permanently shifted. When you build an entire life on a foundation of intimidation, fake wealth, and massive lies, the collapse isn't a slow, graceful decline. It is a violent, immediate freefall. I didn't stay around the town to watch the wreckage unfold in person. I simply drove back to my quiet, fully paid-for home overlooking the Pacific Ocean, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and went back to my life. I had a $120 million restoration project to run, and I wasn't going to waste another second of my mental energy on the people who had tried to destroy me. But in a highly connected, gossip-fueled town like Silver Oak Valley, news travels faster than light, and I didn't have to look hard to find out exactly what was happening to my father's empire. The financial execution of Victor Bennett was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Exactly 3 weeks after the disastrous wedding reception, the massive fallout reached its absolute peak. The 3 biggest and most crucial financial investors in my father's inner circle, the exact same men who had been sitting in the VIP section of the country club watching my presentation, officially and legally completely severed all ties with his company. They didn't just politely withdraw their funding. They unleashed an army of corporate lawyers and forensic accountants to aggressively tear through my father's financial records, desperate to salvage whatever capital they had foolishly tied up in his fraudulent ventures. Without that massive influx of investor cash, and with the undeniable proof that he did not legally own the 10 acres of lakefront property used as collateral, the bank immediately froze all of his commercial credit lines. The Eagle Crest luxury resort, the massive, multi-million-dollar crown jewel that my father had sacrificed his own daughter to build, was officially completely dead in the water. The massive construction crews were ordered to pack up their heavy machinery, the building permits were permanently revoked by the panicked city council, and the sprawling development site was chained shut with heavy padlocks. Victor Bennett's invincible social reputation, the terrifying aura of power he had maintained over the town for decades, was completely annihilated overnight. He couldn't even walk into his favorite local diner or show his face at the country club without people pointing, staring, and aggressively whispering about the massive federal fraud investigation hanging over his head. The local newspapers, the same ones my parents had once used to plant fake stories about me running away, were now relentlessly printing front-page articles about his catastrophic financial ruin. But my father wasn't the only one paying the ultimate price for their 20-year lie. My mother, Caroline, experienced a completely different kind of absolute devastation. For Caroline, money was important, but her social standing was her actual lifeblood. She thrived on being the undisputed queen of the valley, the woman who dictated who was accepted into high society and who was ruthlessly cast out. In the weeks following the wedding, the incredibly wealthy, elite women she had spent years drinking martinis and gossiping with turned on her with a vicious, breathtaking speed. 3 weeks after the reception, Caroline was formally and unceremoniously kicked off the board of directors for every single local charity she had previously controlled. The exclusive country club where she spent most of her afternoons suddenly lost her reservation requests. The society wife stopped returning her phone calls, completely ghosting her in the exact same cold, calculated way my mother had ghosted me when I was a 17-year-old girl standing on the driveway with nothing but a backpack. She was entirely exiled from the very world she had worshipped her entire life, trapped inside her massive, rapidly depreciating estate with a husband who was facing potential federal prison time. And then there was Lily, the beautiful, glowing bride, the golden child who had spent her entire life being heavily spoiled and protected from the real world, was suddenly slammed face-first into a brutal reality. Her new husband, a man who had married her under the strict assumption that he was joining a highly prestigious, wealthy, and legally sound family, wanted absolutely nothing to do with the toxic, radioactive fallout of the Bennett name. Just 3 short weeks after they stood at the altar and promised to stay together for better or for worse, her husband packed his bags, walked out the front door, and moved entirely out of their shared home. He left the golden child sitting completely alone in a massive, quiet house, her supposedly perfect fairy tale life shattered into a million unfixable pieces. That I knew all of this was happening through the unavoidable local news cycle and the occasional text from Ryan, who found immense joy in tracking my family's rapid downfall. But I never actively reached out to any of them. I didn't send a gloating message, and I didn't demand an apology. I simply let them drown in the consequences of their own actions. Then, on a quiet Tuesday evening, exactly 3 weeks after the wedding, my private cell phone rang that I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing some structural blueprints for the historic mill, when I saw the caller ID. It was Lily. I honestly considered letting it go straight to voicemail. I figured she was calling to scream at me, to blame me for her husband leaving, or to demand that I somehow fix the massive legal disaster our father was facing. But something in my gut told me to pick up the phone, just to hear what the golden child sounded like when the gold was finally stripped away. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. Hello! For a long time, there was nothing but heavy, shaky breathing on the other end of the line. I was just about to hang up when she finally spoke. Her voice was incredibly small, completely devoid of the arrogant, vicious sneer she had used when she told me not to ruin her wedding photos. She sounded utterly exhausted, broken, and terrified. "Arya," Lily whispered, her voice cracking heavily. "He left me. He actually left me." I sat perfectly still, my eyes scanning the architectural blueprint on the counter. "I know, Lily. I saw the news. Everything is gone," she continued, openly sobbing into the phone now. "Dad is locked in his office all day with a team of panic-stricken lawyers. The bank is threatening to foreclose on the main house. Mom won't even get out of bed because none of her friends will speak to her. It's a total nightmare, Arya. It's all completely gone. I didn't offer her any comfort. I didn't tell her it was going to be okay, because it wasn't. Actions have consequences, Lily. You all spent 20 years building a life on stolen land and massive lies. Gravity always wins eventually." There was another long, heavy pause on the line. I could hear her sniffing, trying to pull herself together. When she spoke again, the words she said were the absolute last thing I ever expected to hear from her mouth. "I always thought you were the problem," Lily said softly, her voice trembling. "Growing up, Dad and Mom always told me you were broken. They told me you were selfish, that you ran away, that you hated us. I believed them, Arya. I believed every single word they said because it was easier than looking at the truth." She took a deep, ragged breath. "But you didn't do this to us. Dad did this. Mom let him. And I stood there and laughed at you while they tried to destroy you." She paused, and then she finally said it, for the very first time in our entire lives. "You are not the bad guy, Arya." I closed my eyes, leaning heavily against the cool marble of my kitchen counter. Hearing those words didn't magically erase the 2 decades of profound trauma, the homelessness, or the psychological abuse. It didn't fix the fact that they had weaponized my medical sterility for public entertainment. But it was a definitive, undeniable closing of a chapter. The illusion was completely shattered, even for the golden child. "I know I'm not the bad guy, Lily," I replied quietly. "I've known that for 20 years. I didn't wait for her to respond. I simply hung up the phone, placed it face down on the counter, and went back to my blueprints. Hanging up the phone with Lily was a profound moment of closure, but the reality was that my fight wasn't completely over just because my family's social empire had crumbled into dust. The emotional ghost of my past had been exorcised, but there was still a very massive, physical scar sitting right on the edge of Crystal Lake. The 10 acres of pristine waterfront property that had started this entire 20-year nightmare were still technically an active construction site, littered with the decaying, half-finished concrete foundations of my father's fraudulent Eagle Crest luxury resort. I didn't just want the legal title to the land securely locked in my safe. I wanted to completely and permanently cleanse that beautiful property of Victor Bennett's toxic legacy that I hired the most aggressive, relentless real estate attorneys in California to formally reclaim physical control of the property. Because the massive bank loans had been secured through undeniable, highly documented federal fraud, the legal eviction of my father's bankrupt development company took less than a month. I will never forget the crisp Tuesday morning when I drove my car out to Crystal Lake, handed a court-ordered demolition permit to a local foreman, and watched a fleet of heavy yellow bulldozers completely pulverize the massive concrete pillars of the Eagle Crest Resort. Watching those ugly, soulless structures crumble into a cloud of gray dust felt like exhaling a heavy breath I had been holding in my lungs since I was a terrified 17-year-old girl standing on the street with a $70 net worth. The earth was finally taking back exactly what had been stolen from it. At a few weeks after the demolition was complete and the land was cleared, I drove out to a high-end, peaceful cardiac recovery facility to visit my grandmother, Margaret Hale. She had successfully survived her high-risk heart surgery, and thanks to the massive salary I was earning as a lead architect, I was able to move her entirely out of Victor's controlling grasp and into a private, luxurious suite overlooking a beautiful, quiet garden. When I walked into her sunlit room, she was sitting in a comfortable armchair, reading a book and looking stronger and more vibrant than she had in years. I sat down next to her, holding her warm hand, and we talked for hours about the chaotic, devastating aftermath of the wedding that I admitted to her that a small, lingering part of me felt a twinge of heavy guilt for how spectacular and catastrophic the fallout had been for my mother and sister. I told her about Lily's tearful phone call, about how my sister's husband had packed his bags and moved out, and about how completely isolated and humiliated our family had become in the valley. My grandmother simply listened, her sharp eyes studying my face with a deep, profound understanding that transcended generations. She gently squeezed my hand, shook her head slowly, and offered me a piece of wisdom that completely erased any remaining shadows of guilt in my heart. She looked right at me, her voice steady and clear, and told me that I didn't destroy the family, I just turned on the lights. She was absolutely right. The rot had always been there, festering entirely in the dark, and all I had done was refuse to let them hide it in the shadows anymore. With my grandmother's blessing and my soul finally at peace, I went back to my architectural drafting table and completely threw myself into a brand new, deeply personal project. The 10 acres at Crystal Lake were officially mine, completely cleared of my father's debris, and sitting as a massive, beautiful blank canvas. I had investors and elite developers constantly calling my private number, offering me staggering, multi-million-dollar sums to buy the land or partner on a new luxury housing subdivision. I flatly rejected every single one of them. I didn't need more money, and I certainly didn't want to build another exclusive, gated fortress for the ultra-wealthy elite of Silver Oak Valley to hide behind. I wanted to build something that represented the exact opposite of everything the Bennett family stood for. Exactly 1 year later, on a bright, beautiful Saturday afternoon, I stood on the grassy banks of Crystal Lake for a massive grand opening event. But this event looked absolutely nothing like the toxic, stressful, and heavily judged country club spectacles my mother used to meticulously orchestrate. There were no expensive martinis, no gossiping society wives in designer dresses, and no desperate politicians trying to secure backdoor investments. Instead, the cool California air was filled with the sounds of acoustic guitar music, the smell of fresh food from local vendors, and the joyous, echoing laughter of hundreds of children running freely through the grass. Behind me, sitting on the exact spot where my father had planned to build his exclusive, soulless waterfront villas, stood a breathtaking, modern architectural masterpiece. It was a sprawling, beautifully designed structure made of warm natural wood and massive, floor-to-ceiling glass panels that perfectly reflected the sparkling blue water of the lake. I had officially designed, funded, and built the Margaret Hale Cultural Center. It wasn't a private corporate resort, and it wasn't a massive mansion designed to show off personal wealth. It was an expansive, beautifully lit public library filled with thousands of books, a vibrant art center with free creative classes for local kids who needed a safe space to express themselves, and a massive, perfectly landscaped community park that was entirely open to the public, regardless of their zip code or their bank account balance. I watched Ryan Carter, my absolute best friend in the world, laughing loudly and handing out free ice cream to a group of kids near the newly built playground. I saw Eleanor Blackwood, the most powerful and intimidating woman in the state, casually walking through the public art gallery with a genuine, relaxed smile on her face, quietly admiring the bright watercolors painted by local high school students. The environment was so incredibly pure, so entirely devoid of the toxic, crushing vanity that had defined my entire childhood, that I actually felt hot tears welling up in my eyes. They weren't tears of pain or humiliation like the ones my family had tried to force out of me. They were tears of absolute, overwhelming victory that I walked away from the busy crowd for a moment, stepping down to the quiet, muddy edge of the lake, and let the cool breeze wash over my face. I thought back to that massive, terrifying 12-meter LED screen at the Redwood Ridge Country Club. I thought about the horrible, blood-red words my family had weaponized to try and publicly destroy my spirit: dropout, gold digger, divorced, broke, and above all, sterile. They had tried so desperately to define me by what I had lost, by what I lacked, and by what my body was physically incapable of doing. I looked back over my shoulder at the beautiful, towering cultural center, at the hundreds of happy, smiling people filling the public park, and at the incredible, undeniable legacy of life and art I had built from absolute scratch. My family had stood in front of 400 people and cruelly called me sterile, a failure, and entirely useless. But as I watched the genuine joy blooming on the exact same land they had so violently tried to steal, I realized the ultimate, undeniable truth about the Bennett bloodline. They could buy all the massive mansions in the world, they could fake 1,000 perfect, plastic smiles for the local newspapers, and they could pretend to be untouchable royalty. But the thing that truly couldn't be born in that family was kindness. And that was a completely different, deeply tragic kind of sterile that no amount of money, power, or country club prestige could ever cure.